How does change happen in history? Is it the work of great figures, kings, queens, emperors, empresses, czars, and czarinas? Of great inventors, great explorers, great artists, great writers? Is that the way it works? Or does change come through the labors, the cooperation, the combined efforts of lots of ordinary people, of thousands or millions of ordinary people combining their forces in the name of a good cause, or for that matter, a bad cause? Is that the way history works? Well, yes and yes. Sometimes there are these great figures of history that have an inordinate influence on the way things turn out. Catherine the Great of Russia spread the influence of Moscow, the Russian throne, from Europe to the Pacific, and made Russia into the great empire it became. Napoleon remade the face of Europe for the period of his life and had after effects that lasted for decades into the future. But there are also mass movements of people. One of the biggest changes, maybe the biggest change in the history of the world, at the face of the planet, is the migration of millions and millions of people over the centuries. And these were usually individual decisions made by individuals, by families. Occasionally they were driven by actions of governments, but for the most part it was individuals making these decisions. And there are various instances of popular uprisings. The French Revolution began largely as a movement of protest by ordinary people, first in Paris and in other parts of the country. The Russian Revolution, it was kind of guided by a group that called itself the Bolsheviks, but without the support of the individuals, it wouldn't have taken place. The People Power Revolution in the Philippines and equivalent movements, the Arab Spring of 2011, and after this, this toppled governments, and this was really a manifestation of lots of people. In American history, the American Revolution was indeed inspired, or maybe it was guided by the thought, by the words, by the actions of people like James Otis and Sam Adams and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, but it was the thousands of Americans who threw their support in favor of independence that pushed it across the line. So history changes in various ways. One of the ways history changes is through changes in, technology, changes in the way people interact with the physical spaces around them. Very often, these sorts of changes aren't thought of as historical exactly, but there are inventions, there are machines, new devices that can change history quite radically. And two that had a great influence on the civil rights movement, on race relations in the United States, were two inventions that had nothing to do with race relations and had nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with anything but what they were narrowly designed to do. The first of these is something that people didn't think of much until it was invented. That is air conditioning. Air conditioning was originally devised to improve manufacturing processes. There were various kinds of ways of working with paper and fibers that required air to be conditioned. So it always had to be at roughly the same temperature and the same humidity. Otherwise, things would stick together and the manufacturing process wouldn't work out. And so the first air conditioners were designed precisely for those purposes. Now, it also happened that when the air was conditioned to make it easier to work with these fibrous materials, it made it more comfortable for the workers to work there. In some cases, the air conditioning, we think of air conditioning as cooling air and usually drying it out, but in some cases you can condition air so it's more moist. But anyway, once it was discovered, once people discovered, inventors, manufacturers discovered that you could change the temperature of air, that you could change the humidity of air, then after a while, people decided, hey, why don't we do this for human comfort? Until the beginning of the 20th century, it was possible, and it had been possible for thousands of years, to warm things up. So when humans first tamed fire, when they acquired the knack of making fire, then they could raise the temperature, which made it possible to live in cold climates and to do stuff in cold areas that you couldn't or wouldn't want to do otherwise. So for thousands of years, probably tens of thousands of years, humans had been able to raise the temperature of things. But to lower the temperature of things, now that was pretty hard. You could, well, first thing you could do is go someplace where it was cooler. This is one of the reasons that people who could afford to would take summer vacations to the coast or to the mountains. Very often that was cooler than the hot, low interior. And that was also done for public health reasons as well, to avoid getting infections that were more prominent during the summer. But the idea that you could cool off, well, basically to cool off you had to go up, because it's usually cool higher up, so you go up to the mountains, or you would go to the coast because ocean water usually in summer is cooler than the air around it, at least in a lot of places. You'd go to places where the water was cooler than the air. And that helped a lot. But the idea that you might actually be able to change the temperature, that is, lower the temperature of the air in the places that you lived, there had been some attempts to do it with using ice. And so if you were a Roman emperor, you could afford to have ice brought in from the mountains, perhaps the Alps, and put in a place, and you could blow air across it and you could get the cooling breezes. It was also discovered that you could cool air by evaporating water. And in various places these are called swamp coolers or evaporative coolers. And you even see these at outdoor restaurants these days, where they'll have a spray blowing a mist in front of a fan. And as the air goes through the mist, it evaporates some of the water. But evaporating the water takes heat out of the air, and the air comes across as cooler. So that sort of thing had been done. And there were ways of designing homes and buildings to retain the coolness of night. So in places where it does cool off at night, you could make big stone or other masonry buildings, and they would stay cool. And then you'd open the windows and the doors at night and let the cool air in, and they'd cool off. And then when it started getting warm in the morning, late morning, you'd close them up, and they would retain the cool and keep out the heat. So there was that kind of passive approach. But an active approach, actively cooling air, this awaited the beginning of the 20th century. And as I said, in the first place, it was used for industrial purposes, but gradually it was applied to increase human comfort. The first air conditioning systems, the first cooling systems, were expensive. And they were more expensive and too big for people to put in houses. So they were put in places where lots of people would gather. So they were put in movie theaters. And so going to the movies during the summer in the 1920s, one of the attractions was that you'd see the movies, but another attraction was you might get cool. And in other gathering places where you could justify spreading the cost of the air conditioning machinery over the large number of people, and they had to be commercial enterprises because people were going to pay to go there. But gradually, the technology improved so that you could put it in, say, offices, office buildings. Again, these are commercial enterprises, but finally it got to the point where you could put air conditioning in individual homes. Now, it was still a relative rarity up through World War II, so up through the 1940s. If you lived in the South, you got used to hot weather during the summer, hot and often humid weather during the summer. By South, I mean pretty much everywhere from, well, Maryland south, and including Texas. You got used to being hot during the summer. You put in ceiling fans. So once electricity arrived, that helped because you could move the air even if the air was still hot. And so you put in ceiling fans, and I remember, when I moved from Oregon to Texas, and this was, of course, much after this, it was in the 1980s, but people in Oregon didn't bother much with ceiling fans because you could open the windows and air would go through. But in Texas, Ceiling fans are great because, they move the air around and they're relatively quiet, and so they effectively cool you off by moving the air, which evaporates the moisture off your skin and cools you off that way. Air conditioning as air conditioning only really caught on in about the 1950s and 1960s. It's when people had the money to build new homes. So there was a big building boom all across the country, but especially in the South, what came to be called the Sun Belt, in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. And as these new homes were built, very often they had air conditioning systems. And if you live in a place like Texas, if you live in a place like Florida, if you live in Mississippi or Tennessee or Georgia or even Virginia, it's really nice to be able to cool your house during the summer. It changed the way people operated. It changed the way people scheduled events. It changed people's entire perceptions of life and of regions of the country. The Congress of the United States typically took long summer recesses. This dated back to the days long before air conditioning, but Washington, D.C. was and still is, without air conditioning, a very uncomfortable place to live during the summer. And so the members of Congress would just go back to their homes, wherever the homes were. Once air conditioning became available, then it was possible to reschedule. And so people would start to move to the South who hadn't thought of it before. If you were born in Texas, if you're born in Houston, you got used to the summers and you could probably deal with it, this before air conditioning. But if you hadn't been born in the South, then the idea that you might move from Boston to Austin, no, people simply wouldn't do it. They might come and spend half of the summer and then they'd flee north because they think they were dying. They'd landed in a sauna and they didn't want to live there. Once air conditioning became available, once it became common, then perceptions changed, attitudes changed. And now we're talking about the 1950s, 1960s, and sort of full-blown into the 1970s. So by the 1970s, new home construction in the South, at least the home that ordinary middle-class people would buy, they almost always had air conditioning, which all of a sudden made the South, in many ways, a more attractive place to live than the North. Because, as I say, you can heat air, but even if you can heat the air, if you live in Buffalo, or if you live in Boston, or Burlington, Vermont, or someplace like that, you can heat the air inside your house, but you still got all that snow outside and all those icy roads, and just the difficulty of getting around during the winter. If you live in Florida, it's hot during the summer, but you can air condition. And during the winter, it's great, and you don't have to deal with snow. So once air conditioning became common, one of the things that happened is the South, especially Florida and then Arizona, became a mecca for people to move. And people would retire from places like New York, and they'd retire to Florida because it just seemed a lot easier place to live. And again, air conditioning made this possible. Well, it made something else possible too. It made it possible for the Sun Belt to boom as an economic sector of the country. Because now, national corporations would think of opening offices in the South to a degree they hadn't before. They would even think of moving their headquarters to the South. So Atlanta was a booming city, and Atlanta became headquarters for lots of national and international corporations. Houston became the energy capital of the world during this period. And again, people who would never think of moving themselves or their businesses to a hot climate like Texas or Georgia, all of a sudden hardly thought anything of it because, hey, there's always air conditioning. And again, winters are great and summers are bearable because there's air conditioning. So the Sun Belt was a consequence of air conditioning more than of any other single factor. But there was a side effect that was crucial in all of this. Once the Sun Belt became sort of more part of the rest of the United States. And once people from the rest of the country started looking to the South, not so much as a region apart, a place they would never move to, a place they might not ever even visit, they began paying more attention to political affairs, race relations in the South. The South was viewed as part of America rather than this region apart. I don't want to exaggerate this too much, but it's important to know. This is a principal reason that the Jim Crow system of segregation persisted as long as it did in the American South. From the period right after the Civil War, from the 1870s into the 1960s. And it lasted that long despite the fact that most people in the North thought it was a terrible way of organizing race relations or running the politics of a state or a region, but they had almost no personal exposure to it. It was a bad thing, but it was somebody else's bad thing. But once air conditioning opens up the South to people from outside the region, and they come and they see, oh, wait, is this the way it's going on? Is this what's been going on all these years? Then the exposure to the rest of the country that air conditioning made possible was something that was behind a lot of the growing support for civil rights reform in the South. Again, until the 1950s, until the 1960s, the race problems of the South, and they were often thought of as problems by the North, the racial affairs of the South were generally seen as the South's problem. And since most of the population of the country lived in the North and in the West, who cared about the South, really? It's only when there developed a critical mass nationally for civil rights reform that civil rights reform took hold. Okay, so air conditioning was a crucial element in integrating, in the economic sense, the South to the rest of the economy, but in the process, it furthered the efforts of people to integrate the South racially. There was another technology. There was another technology that was at least as important as air conditioning, and this is television. And television came along at about the same time as air conditioning, and for similar reasons. The rise of air conditioning had a lot to do with the rise of the standard of living of the American middle class. Same thing for television. Television had actually been invented in the 1930s, but it was too expensive for ordinary people to buy. And television suffered from one of these chicken and egg kind of things, because until there were television stations that were broadcasting programs that you might want to watch, it didn't make any sense to buy a television set, a television receiver, because there was nothing to see, there was nothing to receive. But until a lot of people had television sets, it didn't make economic sense for anybody to produce the programs to broadcast that would be seen on the television set. So it was kind of who goes first here? You know, is that a chicken and the egg? It's kind of like the rollout of 5G in communications technology. There are smartphones that have 5G capabilities, but if there are no 5G networks, what's the point? And so until there's a 5G network, why buy a 5G phone? But if there aren't a lot of people with 5G phones, how can you justify building a 5G network? So anyway, it's this sort of thing. Television was that way. And in the case of most other technology, including 5G phones and technology, prices usually go down over time. So as the prices of television sets fell during, well, the first broadcasts were in the 1930s, and they were just kind of local things. There might have been greater progress during the 1940s, but World War II put all sorts of non-military innovation and development off the table. That had to wait until the end of the war. But it was really in the 1950s that the American middle class booms, and that the price of electronics fell, that Americans were able to buy television sets in large numbers. And so essentially, in 1950, nobody in the United States owned a TV set. In 1960, I'm not going to say most people in the United States owned a TV set, but there were millions of TV sets around. By the 1950s. And television might have been the single most transformative technology or communications technology in American history, in world history. Yeah, you can talk about the telegraph. That was a really big deal because the telegraph allowed you to send messages faster than people could actually travel. Until the telegraph was invented, to get a message from A to B, somebody had to go from A to B. With the telegraph, the electrons go, and so they can go a lot faster than people. So the telegraph and then radio. Radio was a big deal, no question about it. Because now you could transmit voices and spoken messages and music and sorts of other things over distances and to lots of people at once. But it was television. It was television that really put people there, that allowed you to see things. Now again, there had been photography, and so you could see pictures of things. And there had even been newsreels. These were small, short movies that were like a news TV show. It wasn't TV, they were short films. And they were shown typically in intermissions between double features at movie houses. They weren't shown in your own home because people didn't have film projection equipment in their own homes. But television, first of all, it was in your own home. And the first televisions were typically in wooden boxes that were made to look like a piece of furniture, and they had a big cathode ray tube, so it was deep and heavy. And it was something that, well, initially only one per household because they were expensive, and you'd put it in the living room or the family room or someplace like that, and everybody would gather around. But it was almost like magic in that it could take you from wherever your living room was to wherever the television cameras were. And it brought, not only did you see things you hadn't seen before, photography did that, newsreels did that, but you could see them as they were happening. Live television. This was a huge change in people's perceptions of the world, and it came along in the 1950s and 1960s. I was about to say it came along as the civil rights protest movement of the 1950s was unfolding. Well, the fact that the civil rights movement was unfolding in the 1950s, that wasn't just a coincidence that TV came along. It was television that, like air conditioning, brought the situation in the South, the Jim Crow system in the South, to the minds, to the living rooms of people in the rest of the country. And when they saw, for example, the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 and 1956, where black people in Montgomery, Alabama, were refusing to take their places on the back of the bus. Rosa Parks had been instrumental in triggering this. And hundreds and then thousands of workers in Birmingham would be trudging along the streets and roads of Birmingham, boycotting the buses in protest of the segregationist, the Jim Crow policy on the buses. And you could see this on television. And the news networks would carry live footage of these hundreds of thousands of people trudging miles to work. They could have ridden on the buses if they had been willing to ride in the back, if they had been willing to accept the Jim Crow status quo. But their protest said we're not going to. And their protest wasn't a protest confined simply to Birmingham or simply to Alabama or simply to the South. This was a protest that could be seen in every living room in America, and indeed in living rooms around the world. And by the way, that world aspect was not unimportant. As long as the South's problems were confined to the South, Northerners could ignore them, Westerners could ignore them, but also Americans could be confident that the world was ignoring them. But television, among other things, made these protests, made the system of segregation in the South apparent to the rest of the world. And many Americans were embarrassed by what the world was seeing. The United States, this is the land of the free. This is a country that's based on the idea that all men are created equal. And this is what we're showing the world. In fact, there was a great irony in the circumstance that the American capital, Washington, D.C., was in a segregated part of the country, and Washington, D.C. itself was segregated, which meant that even diplomats, ambassadors from countries who happened to be black or people of color, They couldn't go into the best restaurants in Washington, D.C. They couldn't stay in the better hotels. Now, this was not a big deal until the 1940s and 1950s. Before that time, there weren't any black ambassadors because the African countries were nearly all parts of British empire, so they didn't have diplomatic representation in Washington. But as Africa decolonized and as the newly independent African countries began sending ambassadors to Washington, it became an embarrassment for the United States to have the capital and the region around the capital to be a place where a distinguished diplomat from Ghana or from Nigeria was clearly relegated to second-class status in the United States. So, and I'm certainly not going to say that television alone, no, it was a case of several things coming together. There was, in an earlier lecture, I mentioned that World War II opened the eyes of American blacks to the fact that they were being asked to defend democracy when they didn't really participate in democracy at home. So all these other things came together. Air conditioning contributed to this, television contributed to this. But television was one of those revolutionary, transformative technologies. And it made possible, it made necessary changes to institutions that had been frozen in place for a long time. And there came along people who understood the new technology and knew how to put it to use. So the protests of the 1950s and the 1960s were protests that were designed to appeal to the conscience of America. Now, those protests could have been made in the 1910s and the 1920s, but they wouldn't have had a chance to get any access to the conscience of America because there wasn't the communications technology for America beyond the South to see the protests themselves. And Southern whites, had become inured to this and say, okay, this is our situation and we're not going to change it. But as I say, when the protests became apparent to people living outside the South, then there was this surge of support for change. And so the sit-ins at lunch counters in North Carolina, for example, in the early 1960s, and protest marches, especially protest marches, the idea that you could get thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people for the March on Washington in 1963. Well, it's a huge deal in Washington, but put it on television, and Americans around the country can see that, first of all, there is this protest, there's this devoted protest to civil rights reform, and there are all these people behind it. If you see the crowds yourself on television, it's a different thing than reading about them. Maybe more dramatic was the televised violence against those people who were marching in favor of civil rights and voting rights. So Selma, Alabama became a sore spot in the American conscience in 1965 when a civil rights march resulted in the beating by police of people who simply wanted to go register to vote. And once you saw it on camera, you could not deny that it was happening. And you could tell that the white supremacist opponents of civil rights reform, of voting rights reform in the South, typically said that these are just a few outside agitators that are coming in to disturb our domestic institutions. Well, the televised protests, the televised beatings, they gave the lie to this. You could see that these were peaceful people walking down the street and they were getting the daylights beat out of them. So television brought the world to the South. It brought the bright light of publicity to the Jim Crow system. And Jim Crow simply couldn't survive that scrutiny. And as the South became more and more part of the rest of the country with air conditioning and other things that went with it, then the South was no longer a region apart. And when the South could no longer be a region apart, then Jim Crow couldn't survive. And the Jim Crow system did not.